I'm Nicole Johnston, and you're listening to 7am. It's been a rollercoaster ride on the global oil market, with wild swings in petrol prices at the bowser. The war against Iran has caused panic buying in Australia and around the world. Meanwhile, our government's being criticised for not having greater reserves of petrol, diesel and jet fuel, and for not imposing higher taxes on giant gas companies, which are now raking in a fortune thanks to the war. Today, Federal Energy Minister Chris Bowen on whether this country is prepared for the worst energy crisis in more than 50 years, and the war, should we even be backing it? It's Thursday, March 26. Minister, the critics of this government, they're saying that warnings about our lack of fuel reserves have been largely ignored for over a decade. And that on top of that, Australia's the only country in the 32-member International Energy Agency that continually fails to meet our obligations to have 90 days of oil in store. So would you accept that Australia and this government should have been better prepared for a crisis like this?
Well, I would say, Nicole, is this, and I understand that argument entirely, but what I would say is this. When we came to office in 2022, our oil stocks were still held in Texas. We changed that by signing the minimum stock obligation regulation, which then requires the companies to hold their stocks in Australia. That's been vital. You know, I had to release some of that the other week, and it does take some time to get the stocks from Geelong and Brisbane into the supply, but it's a lot quicker than getting it from Texas. They still wouldn't be here if we'd ever done that right at the beginning of the crisis. Second point is that we have also worked to ensure we keep 2 refineries. There had been 6, but we've worked to ensure that we keep 2. The final point, just about the 90-day thing, because you do hear that a lot. I do just want to deal with that. That's legitimate conversation, but quite a separate issue. 90 days is not how much petrol you use. It's a 90-day number of 90 import days, and they can be held anywhere. And it's not for domestic supply. It's to be able to sell it if things get rough and the IEA asks us to. Now, we don't comply with that, but if we did try to keep 90 days worth in Australia, that would cost $20 billion over 4 years. Now, people can argue for that, sure, but, you know, for our listeners, that's $20 billion we're not spending on schools, hospitals, or anything like that. So that's a big, big call. There's a reason why consecutive governments haven't done the 90 days. I think every new energy minister has asked, I certainly did, why don't we do 90 days? And you get the advice, well, it's going to cost $20 billion. And you think, well, that's pretty hard to find. So it's a legitimate conversation, but we're actually more prepared, I think, better prepared, certainly than when we went into Ukraine. We've got those 38 days of petrol, 30 days of diesel, 30 days of jet fuel. And, you know, sure, people can say we need more, but it's a lot more than we've had previously.
If we could move on to that issue of fuel rationing, I know that you've been saying that there's no plan to do that. It's not a discussion that we have to have yet, but your department has been doing some modelling around it in case this crisis escalates. So could you give us an idea of what rationing would look like, and what is the threshold to actually implement those types of emergency measures? What would it take?
Yeah, so actually there is this thing called the Liquid Fuel Emergency Plan. It's just a guide. It's not government policy, but it's existed under all governments since 2006. And it does give a pretty good guide as to the sorts of things. And it says, you know, first governments would encourage reduced fuel use, carpooling, public transport use. It doesn't talk about work from home because that wasn't a thing when it was written, but, you know, those sorts of things. And then it runs through the various powers of the states and my powers. Now, it's got a particular thing in there about the federal rationing. I wouldn't do it that way. I just wouldn't do it that way. But look, it's really, that conversation really only comes if supply gets crunched. So not demand. We wouldn't do that with what we're dealing with at the moment, demand. But, you know, in the worst case scenario, this war rolls on for months and months and months. And, you know, the supply of oil to the Asian refineries is really constrained, and therefore the supply of petrol and diesel to Australia is really constrained. And governments, state and federal, would have to then, you know, work through, we'll do voluntary public communications campaigns, we'll do that, and then, you know, look at all our different powers, the state's powers are much more flexible and they can do different things. So look, again, I understand it's a bit of a complicated message because I'm not saying, this is a simple question, but I'm just trying to give a very honest, straightforward, frank assessment that we are not, I don't think we're there. I don't envisage being there. But of course, we are dealing with the biggest energy crisis in history. And so, there does need to be governments working together about prudent contingency planning.
Can I just pick you up on two of those points? The National Liquid Fuel Emergency Act. Is it out of date? Because it sounds like it's a bit old if it doesn't have this work from home issue in it. And the other point that you made, it sounds as though your preference is that the states deal with this if it reached this point, rather than it being done at a federal level in terms of emergency fuel laws. If that was to happen, couldn't we just end up with a big mess with all the states doing something different? And isn't that what the Victorian Premier has indicated already, that she's not a fan of that idea?
No, they're both legitimate questions. So firstly, there's two things. There's the National Fuel Emergency Act, which gives me powers if we invoke. It's never been invoked before. And then there's separately a liquid fuel emergency plan policy document, which is owned by all the governments. It's a little bit dated in that it doesn't talk about work from home, but it does have other things in it which are relevant and can be relatively easily refreshed and updated. On the second plan, again, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but just because we point out that states have powers, and historically rationing's been done state by state. When I was a boy growing up in Sydney in 1980s, Neville Wrane had to ration petrol. It was done state level. That's not to say that, governments aren't working together, comparing notes, trying to make sure that we take consistent approaches across the board, is appropriate in a difficult circumstance. So we're doing that. The states are doing that. It's a bit difficult because, I understand why you're asking these questions, Nicole, but you're sort of asking me to move forward, to several stages ahead. And that's a legitimate thing to ask me, but it's not actually where we are or what we're contemplating needing just right now.
Coming up, the war in Iran. Should we even be in it? Minister, across the country, as we know, so many Australians are now struggling with these fuel prices, rising interest rates, and at the same time, the gas companies are making massive profits from this global crisis. And we do have politicians like David Coch saying it is time that Australians got a greater share of all of these profits.
That gas belongs to all Australians. Companies can export it, they can make a profit, but they should be paying us 25% of whatever they get for that gas.
Now, I know that you have said it's up to the Treasurer to decide in the next budget, but in theory, do you think that there should be a tax on these wartime profits? Or is the government really just too frightened of the backlash that it would get from big energy companies if it tried to do it?
Now, let me make a couple of points, Nicole, and you've preempted one of my answers, which is fair enough. But I do just want to start with this point. And I know a lot of our listeners will be very passionate about this, and fair enough. A lot of people stop me in the street to talk about it, or forums I do, etc. And, I very much understand and respect that. Firstly, we've got to deal with the factual base, though. I think a lot of people forget, and, people like David Coch don't refer to the fact that in our first term, we've already reformed gas tax once, the PRRT. And it wasn't easy to do. It's not like it was a tick and flip. We were opposed by the gas industry, opposed by the Liberals and Nationals. For quite a while, the Greens didn't support it for different reasons. And eventually Jim got it through. It's $2 billion extra. Now, that's not nothing. I can tell you, as someone who, is in charge of spending a lot of government money, $2 billion is not a small amount. Now, people can argue it needs to be more, sure, but let's not pretend it hasn't happened under the first term of our government. And to your question, are we scared of the gas companies? Well, that was a fight. We wouldn't have done that. So let me just deal with that. Now, secondly, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we're doing a podcast in March. The budget's in May. The Treasurer announces the budget, not the Energy Minister, and I don't talk about cabinet conversations. So I'm not able to shed much more light, and any views I have are shared around the cabinet table, not on podcasts. So we'll see. The Treasurer's made clear he's looking very carefully at tax reform. I think that's a good thing. And let's let him do his work.
Minister, it's now pretty clear that a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, are starting to prioritise their own needs.
China, the world's biggest oil importer and a major fuel exporter, has ordered an immediate ban on refined fuel exports. The ban includes shipments of gasoline, diesel and aviation fuel.
And given our mutual economic dependence with China, are you now in discussions with Beijing about the possibility of having some kind of bilateral agreement where Australia can get its jet fuel in return for continuing to supply its coal and gas?
I'm not going to go into details of our discussions with China, but of course we'll be talking to China at all levels of the government, including me. Now, we're not, to be clear, we're not talking about sort of, transactional arrangements there, but we are talking about ensuring reliability of supply. The situation in the Chinese government, is one where they recognise, at least we can talk to China. The previous government couldn't talk to China. We can. They recognise the importance of the relationship. They recognise very clearly the importance of, you're right, particularly jet fuel. We don't get as much diesel or petrol from China directly as we do from other places like Malaysia and Singapore and Korea. China's a bigger supplier of jet fuel. Certainly, the airlines at the moment are saying pretty similar things to the broader issue, that they're fine at the moment. But, if there's problems, they'll start to become clear in late April and May. We're working with them on that, on contingency planning. I haven't released any of the jet fuel reserve yet. I've done that on purpose to save that for if necessary. So all the above is happening, Nicole, all the above.
The world has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is. The US action was directed at specific sites central to Iran's nuclear program.
The Australian government backed the US and Israel in launching this war. But in the last week, we've had Israel attack Iran's South Pars gas field. And then President Trump, he threatened and then backed off on attacking Iran's power stations. So a few questions. Was it a mistake to support this war, given the effects that we're now seeing, and the fact that a new poll has found just a quarter of Australians support it? And on that type of military action that we're seeing from Israel and the US, does Australia support that type of military action in this war? Military action that is targeting critical infrastructure, which some would argue is against international law?
I think, Nicole, firstly, the Iranian regime is a very bad one. I have many Iranian constituents. It's a terrible regime. Goes so far as to say an evil regime. It murders. It's oppressive. It's terrible on rights of minorities. It's just an awful regime. So therefore, of course, we do not support them, and we support action against them. But having said that, the Prime Minister's been very clear. We want this war to end. We've signed on to the statement of European countries, for example, calling for that. You're right. It is, in many senses, a war on energy infrastructure. And that's why this is the largest energy crisis we've seen. I've lived through three energy crises, the 1970s, 2022 and 2026. And I've been lucky enough to be Energy Minister for two of the three energy crises. I was a boy for the first one. And this is the worst one. This is bigger than the 1970s OPEC oil crisis. And it's bigger than the Ukraine crisis. It's playing out differently, less impact at this point on gas and coal, but much bigger impact on oil. But still, as Fatih Birol said when he was in Australia this week, it's the worst ever.
I would say the world is facing the greatest global energy security threat in the history.
So obviously we want that to end, because while the biggest price is being paid for those people who are losing their lives in the Middle East, the whole world, the people who signed on, didn't sign on, participated, the whole world is paying a price for this.
Would you say, though, that right now the Australian government is out of alignment with voters on this? Because this isn't a war that most Australians support.
Well, I think governments have to make decisions in the national interest and according with our values, not based on opinion polls when it comes to difficult decisions about foreign affairs.
And the issue of supporting military action against critical infrastructure, is that something that concerns you right now, that the war is moving to this phase of not only targeting military installations but energy installations?
Yeah. And the Prime Minister's made it clear that we want to see that stop.
Have you had any direct talks with Israel or the US on that? Have you expressed that concern to them?
Not me directly.
But the government has. The Prime Minister has?
I haven't been in discussions about that. I'm the Energy Minister of Australia. You wouldn't expect me, I don't think, to be engaged in discussions with counterparts about that particular matter. I'm discussing a lot of things with international counterparts late at night, early in the morning with time differences at the moment. But you've asked me a direct question if I've been speaking to the United States and Israel about the military approach. That is not something that I've been participating in.
Minister, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great pleasure, Nicole. Good on you.
Also in the news, the federal government has introduced a new legislation to crack down on companies looking to use the war in the Middle East to rip off Australians. Under the proposed laws, the fines for false and misleading conduct and cartel behaviour will double from $50 to $100 million. The consumer watchdog, the ACCC, says it's received more than 500 complaints of possible price gouging at petrol stations since the start of the war. And US President Donald Trump says he's confident a deal with Iran will be reached to end the war, even as Israel and Tehran continue strikes and the United States sends more troops to the region. President Trump maintains the US is in talks with Iran to end hostilities, something Iran itself has denied. Trump also claims Iranian leadership has offered the US a present he described as worth a tremendous amount of money, without offering further details. I'm Nicole Johnston, and this is 7am. Thanks for listening.